once again, we want to talk with Jim Jordan a little bit more. And Jim, I wanted to ask about the whole in the Reformed world. We're a confessional church. We hold a secondary standards and the Westminster Confession of Faith, for example. And one of our concerns is that in whether it's conscious or not, sometimes the confession and the things that are said in the confession seem to be the standard by which everybody's held, rather than the Scriptures. So, what is your understanding of how the confession, or the Westminster Confession, ought to be used in regard to these whole matters of theology and as standards of orthodoxy and those kinds of things?
Well, I think one thing is that we have to make a distinction between the Reformation confessions, which are very long and cover a whole lot of different areas, and the early church creeds. If we were to take the entire Council of Nicaea and all of its canons, that would be like the Westminster Confession. But we don't. We take the one creed and we say all those canons, well, we don't necessarily live by all that anymore. But the Westminster Confession, the other confessions, Formula of Concord, they're long and they go into all kinds of details, just like the early church councils did. And when we absolutize all of those details, we run the risk of erecting a paper pope. Because the assumption is that history is frozen. And what will happen then as a result of doing that is that there will be revolutions. What's actually happened in our culture is the vast majority of authentic Christians are outside of Presbyterian and Reformed churches, because the issues of the culture have moved on and these churches haven't. So if you try to freeze history and turn everybody into a 17th century Christian who uses 17th century language, you're just going to wind up being a small, irrelevant sect. And that's the danger. The second comment that I think we have to make out of it is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for 21st century Presbyterians to think like the people who wrote those confessions. Interestingly, a lot of material is being published now, or research is being done because other stuff has come to light, memoirs and the like have come to light, where we read the discussions that these men would have over these doctrines, and it's like a completely foreign language theologically. They were using categories and terminology and philosophical ideas that have long since been superseded by Dr. Van Til's work and others. That doesn't mean that the end product that they wrote is no good, or that language is used there, but it does mean that the way they got to those things and the kinds of things that they put into confession, the kinds of things they left out, and what they meant by what they wrote is not always immediately obvious. A perfect example of that is the way the Confession and Catechism speak of the righteousness of Christ as something that we receive. What they meant was the cross work of Christ. But a lot of Presbyterians read that now and they think that means the active obedience of Christ imputed to me, which is something that actually the writers of the Confession explicitly left out. They did not mean that. And yet, if you just read superficially as a modern person with modern questions, you might miss entirely what they mean. So then how do you have full subscription to the Confession without having, a 5-volume set of explaining exactly what it means? You can't. And so I think the Presbyterian Church in America wisely came up with the idea of good faith confession. Because you cannot have confession to a document without a living court of a presbytery that is saying, this is what we all agree here are the important parts. And these are the things that we're going to let people coast on and have different opinions on. This is how we actually interpret what's written here. Because you cannot write a document that pre-interprets everything in the future. And actually, the men who wrote the Confession probably expected that in another 20 or 30 years another confession would have been written, because in their lifetimes 2 or 3 had been written. And yet history froze right there, and now we've kind of got a problem in the Presbyterian churches because of that.
One of the things that a number of writers have pointed out. I'm trying to think of who exactly now, but I remember seeing that the Reformed branch of the church has been one of the branches that writes confessions. That's just one of the things we do, and we did it very quickly. I mean, everybody was doing it. It was
Right.
one of those things within the first, in the Reformation, the first 70 years or so, there must have been 50 confessions. It's amazing how many. And the Westminster Confession was right after the Synod of Dort, and not that long before the Synod of Dort had met. And so it was an idea, like you say. I mean, I think they fully expected more confessions to follow, but they haven't followed. Now, why
Actually,
haven't they followed?
actually, in the among the Covenanters and the Seceders in Scotland, they would write what they call testimonies, which were additional things that went with the confession and interpreted and explained it in terms of what they would mean, dealt with current issues. So they actually kept the confessing tradition alive. It was the larger state churches that were too big and complicated for that to happen that wound up not doing it. And then in America, we haven't done it. We've just reached way back in the past and adopted these, and we haven't kept up these additions. So why that happened, I think it probably had to do with the size of the churches, and then increasingly the belief that, well, we're just not as wise as our forefathers, and so we shouldn't try to do it, forgetting that the men who wrote it were pretty young themselves. So that's another thing that happens. You know, you think you and I are sitting here talking about this, and we are probably about the same age as John Calvin when he died. And yet both of us would probably tend to think of Calvin as this hoary figure, all of whose works were way superior to ours, and most of it, he wrote a lot of it when he was younger than we are today, and we're obviously superior to him now. But that's an odd thing, that we look back at the past at men who were, when they did their work, were younger than maybe we are now, and yet assume that they were far wiser when they were just guys like us.
Right. One of the things that always was said was that this is not a confession writing age, and we don't have the men that they did. And there's a sense, I guess, that there, you know, you look at the caliber of the men, and everybody thinks they were such higher caliber, and many of them were great men. There's no question about it. But are we? What is that really the thing that would prevent us from doing, or improving, or amending, or adding to, or something, building on the confession?
No, and part of the problem there is that the Westminster Assembly had so many men at it, and it lasted for a very long time, that people think, oh, you've got to have something like that again. Well, the Belgian Confession was written by one man.
Right.
And the Westminster Confession is a revision of the Irish Articles, which were written by one man, Bishop Ussher. What we really need is for a whole bunch of guys to write confessions and catechisms, you know, and then out of that percolation, the better ones will surface, and some people will get together and say, this is pretty good, let's make a few adjustments to it. Instead of saying, we can't do it, my sense would be, let's assign 30, we'll just encourage 30 or 40 different guys each to write their own, and then let them float around, because that's what happened at the time of the Reformation.
One of the things that have been opposed is the idea of always reforming, and the idea meaning that we can. I'm trying to figure out why that's opposed, but I think that's the idea is we come up with new things, and liberalism, right? But if we believe in sanctification not only individual but corporate, why shouldn't we be understanding things better? If we're able to stand on the foundations and on the shoulders of these men, why shouldn't we be able to see things better, more clearly?
Yeah, and if we read the Bible history at all, we see that there are these covenantal periods where things undergo something of a revolution, and they gel into a new form, and we should expect that to continue. I think that the fear of it is because liberals used all those ideas in order to get rid of the doctrine of creation and inspiration and inerrancy and virgin birth. Well, semper reformanda, always reforming, always improving. But of course, those men weren't improving their understanding of the Bible. They were improving, so to speak, their amount of worldly philosophy they dragged in to compromise the Bible. So it's really not the same agenda. But liberalism made the conservative churches fearful for 100 years. We've got to get past letting liberals set our agenda and making us all afraid. And I think Spurgeon was right. He said, just open the Bible and let the lion loose. We need to do a lot more of that. We make a few mistakes along the way, so what? The idea is to let the Bible out.